This week's discussion is about loss and grief and trauma, and particularly as it's played out in the book of Daniel. The way we understood the assignment, we're going to keep the Robert material and case study for our own reflection, and we're going to spend the time that we have together talking about the book of Daniel in some detail. So we're going to follow the outline of the questions that was on the PowerPoint. So the first section was just the opening of the show or the episode this time. It was interesting because there was no audio in the replay of the attack, and we'd switch back to singing in church, and the whole family in church switches to the police doing the questioning, and then finally a flashback to Jimmy's hospitalization from way before. So the questions that were posed were, what were our first thoughts? What did we do and what do we feel? Where do we tend to merge with what's going on there? Where do we tend to pull away? And what is it that we wish that we could take control of? So I'll start really easily. As a gay man, I have not been bashed in that kind of a situation, but I have been beaten up as a younger kid by bully in school, sort of thing. So at least I merged, or I had that reaction that like I could understand and see what was going on in the alley as a play out of something that happened to me 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah, just a lot of emotions in that episode. I guess I was sucked in. It was hard to analyze sometimes, but yeah, I guess right away in that opening, I felt the same. Like I'm not gay, but I've been bullied as a kid. Not really as an adult. And yeah, I guess I identified with sort of the singing in church, and was pulled in by that device, using that as a way to connect the two scenes, and of course leaving you wondering how Peter's doing. And I guess living with that uncertainty, I really connected to. Yeah, and wanting to take control, that question. Clearly, we can all, well, I can say I always have a hard time understanding that kind of just outright hatred and bigotry, and just wanting to push some sense and compassion into people. So I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think we just wish the world is better than it actually is. And sometimes we live in our bubble and think that it's okay, and then be confronted by something like that.
Right.
The other thing I had a big reaction to was Jesus leaning on the police car.
Yeah.
I thought that was the end of Peter, frankly.
Oh, really? I didn't interpret it like that. I just interpreted it as Jesus' presence, even Jesus' compassion and presence, even in the tough times. Especially given the theological arguments around homosexuality, right? Like, it was people who want to argue that Jesus would not be present in that place, would, instead, a visual statement that Jesus is right there. I thought that was really powerful. And and as for my emotional reactions, I obviously was guided into wondering what is up with Peter and why he's in church. And so, started getting tight around, whether he has died and
whether this was the funeral, maybe, huh? Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I immediately thought when Grace was singing, wondering if it was the funeral or not. So, yeah. Nothing very much new to add.
Okay. Second section was about the diagnosis that's given by the sister/doctor. And Judith keeps asking the important questions that drive the scene that we were asked to look at. Is he going to die? Why should I believe you this time? And she kind of stomps away. There was also that interesting interaction when Judith breaks down and Daniel's trying to comfort her or hold her there in the room. And all of a sudden he says, Lorraine, Lorraine, and calls for Lorraine to come, which I thought was kind of interesting. I don't know if we want to talk about that very briefly before we hit the specific questions.
Well, I mean, I think was it in our text for this week? I think it was, that talked about the extremely high divorce rate for spouses who have lost a child. And I was reflecting a little bit on that. Like, if two people in a relationship are so incredibly traumatized and wounded, right, I'm sure they must have trouble being present for each other and giving care to each other. And so I wonder if that was sort of, I think it reflected like Daniel's own his own conflictedness and his own recognizing his own limits, but not wanting to abandon her, like, you know, because he called for Lorraine, but at the same time he wanted to stay. And it was, whose sister was the doctor?
I think it's her sister. I had a hard time figuring that out too.
Yeah, but she's some relative. And then she told him to go. So like, yeah, just recognizing they perhaps couldn't be what they needed for each other in that moment. Maybe, yeah. It's kind of interesting. We're supposed to pick a character at this point and talk about some systemic analysis of the person in terms of stage of development, culture, and gender, and all that sort of thing. And I really came down to Bertram and tried to follow him as the bishop a little bit. And of course, he's portrayed pretty clearly as someone from another time. Judith makes a remark about dragging him screaming and kicking, I think it was, into the 20th century or 21st century or whatever. So, you know, obviously older, obviously male, cisgender, presumably heterosexual, since he's having an affair with the other bishop. And I struggled with the idea of stage and where he is and which of the many stages that we talked about that he'd fall into, but certainly he's well developed in terms of his theology and his thinking about God. So it's certainly not that pre-critical kind of understanding of God. I guess that's my story on Bertram for right this moment. I think you tackled Judith. I did. Yeah. Well, you know, she certainly has a privileged worldview. So, you know, ethnicity, you know, white, and they're Episcopal, upper class, cisgender, straight. You know, I think I remember we commented on just that she wasn't very endearing at the beginning of the series. So she's clearly like kind of brittle at times. And like, I wouldn't say withholding, but just sometimes strict, I guess, and a little and by the book. But I guess, you know, I might talk a little later about how much those things might be coping mechanisms and how much they might be personality. But so just not sure, right? I wonder if it's my imagination, or did she seem warmer in the flashbacks? You know, like, I don't know if anyone else noticed that. She seemed more open. She seemed more like everything was right at the edge for her, which obviously it was crisis time. But if you contrast that person that she was with Jimmy and the person we're introduced to at the beginning of the season of the series, like, I don't know, she just she seemed like a much warmer character in the flashbacks, and I don't know whether that's because we ourselves as viewers have gotten to know her. But so I'm just I'm thinking about that difference.
I totally agree with you. I think there are times when I want to love her, and then there are times when I want to hate her. And
yeah.
I think I think that's a really good perception. In the interactions with Jimmy, I think she's a lot more relaxed, and the playing around with the parties and the darts and birthday party and bald and all that kind of stuff is all very cool. The thing where she's not cool, obviously, is her interaction with Peter, and that whole he's not one of us, keep him out of here, I don't want his negative energy around. And then Peter says something like hate much or whatever. I don't know exactly what he says, but where do you think, have you looked in the mirror? I guess he says that's it. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Adam, you want to make a choice? Go for it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the obvious person would be Daniel, but I'm really fascinated with Lorraine. She doesn't play as much in this episode, but I find her character really fascinating. And she's obviously appears to be African American. Not sure about her religion. It seems that her class, she is not from the upper middle class world that the Websters are in, but they have. Was it Daniel's mother who employed her? I think originally.
I think it was the other. I think it was Judah's mother. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you're right.
I'm not sure.
No, you're right, because she had the money. That's so. So she's entered into this world, and I guess as far as her, so she's older. She's dealing with her daughter who doesn't understand why she's there. I guess that's a question for later, but I find her really interesting. And so her worldview, right, is there seems to be some kind of, she wants to repay some kind of debt that she feels to this family. So that really interests me.
I think she's fascinating. I really do. I love the character, and I love the actress that plays her. So the next set of topics is all about the during assessment guidelines and trying to imagine a pastoral relationship with this particular person. They're all gathered at the death scene, the Jimmy's death scene, and I guess that's where we have to go with this. Or I guess we could also do, it does say Peter's hospitalization, but I don't know. I think that they're both, if what we're imagining, we might as well imagine however we want to, I guess. I spent a little time trying to triangulate about the bishop, but I don't know, if I've been successful with this or not. The couple of experiences that I've had in terms of self-reflection with bishops it's been a real variety of people that have been sort of like in the CEO position of the diocese. Some who consider themselves really business oriented, the old-timey bishops that I think Bertram probably would be a lot more identified with in my life, and the fact that I'm going through the formation process in the Episcopal Church, and it is totally up to my bishop if I continue or if I take the next step or whatever. It's a very authoritarian, top-down sort of thing, and I don't mean that as a criticism so much as an observation that these are kind of. I have a feeling that these are very entitled folk and people who become bishops for interesting reasons. I mean, it's like the old question of why somebody leaves the classroom to become a principal or an administrator in a school. Why do they do that? Are they interested in frontline service? Do they see themselves as having more impact beyond that? So anyway, I have some past hang-ups, I guess, or interactions with bishops that I think might be interesting in terms of pastoral care, and how to form sort of a relationship with him. I think would be difficult. I think that they need to feel like they're in charge, and but yet, who cares for the bishop? Who's the person that's caring for the person who's supposedly the shepherd of the flock? I would have obviously a very conflicted role dealing with the bishop as a person who is in formation to be a deacon. There's in the pecking ladder, I'm certainly nowhere, but I think I could ask him some questions that would be interesting to get the ball rolling. I really like the Kornfeld article about the establishing the solution-based relationship, and what are some of the things that you remember about Jimmy or about Peter? What was positive? What were the exceptions to all the problems, I guess. So I think I'll stop there in terms of the first triangle, and maybe we'll talk about the second triangle separate. I don't know. Does that make some sense?
Sure. I mean, I did mine a little bit differently. I went by what's on slide 28, which is sort of just like a list.
Oh, sure.
With the first question about whether loss is part of the problem. Mm-hmm. So for Judith, yes, clearly loss is a big part of the problem. So if we're at the time of Peter's hospitalization, we've got, the acute specter of loss, which is triggering her long-term loss of Jimmy. And in terms of what phase of grief she might be in, I mean, she seems, I guess it's 2 years out from there is when the flashbacks were, right?
I think that's right.
Yeah, like she definitely seems to be back to life, like back to the functioning of her life. So, I can't speak to whether or not she fully integrated all of the phases, but she looks as if she has gone through them. But there are some concerning reactions, right? Clearly, she defaults to alcohol when she's stressed. So that's a coping mechanism that, like, you get the sense that everything is like she's on top of everything until there's just a little bit of stress or disagreement, and then suddenly she needs a drink, right? Like, so not that she's drinking all the time, but it's just like her go-to coping thing. So, okay, the next part describes the losses. And so obviously there's Jimmy. And I would say that along with like the loss of Jimmy, it seems like she perhaps lost an idea of a benevolent God as part of that, which she like evidences in her later, like the idea that she feels like she should have already paid the debt or satisfied God, right? So, so with Peter, at least with this hospitalization, we find that, she doesn't ultimately lose him, but she's going to lose her denial about his situation, right? Like, not that she's actually in denial, but maybe she's sort of partial in denial, like that it's not going to change his life being gay, right? That maybe he can just go on and have the life that she wants for him to have now that, what is it? What was the name of the other boyfriend?
Josh.
Yeah, now that he's gone, right? Like maybe she can just pretend that his life would be the same otherwise, but now maybe she's lost that sort of sense of Peter's long-term safety.
It's interesting to see how the characters evolve too, because remember, she shushes Jimmy up. So I don't want to hear about that right now, when it was obvious that that's where he was going with that conversation. Right. And then the business about, I don't want you in the room, or I don't want him around, sort of thing, versus and the shock of seeing, I think, the two boys in the elevator kissing or holding each other, which, I thought was a very touching scene. Right. She was just like, I can't deal with this, sort of thing. So
yeah, I mean, she clearly already suspected, right? And but she just wanted to delay, right? That there's something that I think there's a way in which she framed recognizing Peter's orientation as a loss of something, right? Her
Some
loss
sort,
of
yeah.
like a loss of her idea of what his life would be like, or a loss of her idea of who he was, and that she couldn't process that at the same time as the loss of Jimmy as well, right? Like, I mean, you know, because it would be really great if she could have, because then she would have been able to care for Peter in the way that he needed to be cared for, right? Because to do that kind of care, you need to really be able to see someone. And clearly she wasn't seeing him, and he was trying to help her to see him. And it was like, you know, not connecting. But at the same time, I can't help but think that she just, like, there's a limit to what people can take.
Right.
And in a way, her delaying was just a self-protection, which might have been warranted at the time. You know, like, I don't know. I can't say. People have a good sense of what they're able to integrate. Perhaps if she had been self-aware enough to recognize her limitation and go get help herself, right? Then she might have been able to expand a little bit more, so to also be able to be there for Peter.
There's just such a lovely interaction between the twins too, I think.
Yeah.
It's very clear that, you know, Peter wants to introduce Josh to his brother before he dies, and it's very clear that they're accepting, and, you know, there's so much nice stuff that's going on there that it's almost all the more jarring when Judith just can't allow that space. So
Yeah.
anyway,
that's
I don't
true.
mean to make it all about that, but
but
so
that's
it's significant.
It is, and complicated, right? Because losses occur not just for individuals, but for systems. And then, so how does the system integrate that loss and regain its equilibrium? Like, that's what we're seeing there, right? Like the calibration, right? The balancing of, and I think Judith was trying to do that in her own limited way. All right, so the second part of the assessment asks about violence. So that, I mean, apart from the violence that is perpetuated against Peter, so that's part of the story, but internally, violence is not part of the story or the dynamics of the family necessarily, though we do see Daniel coping in a certain way later on. I'm not sure, it asks about post-traumatic stress, and I'm not 100% sure I know what to say about that. I would say no, but perhaps I'm not trained enough to notice markers of that. And then the third section asks about different kinds of coping ability. So, right, you know, clearly Judith copes through alcohol. She copes by trying to maintain a sense of being all together, like, as in, like, having everything in hand. She seems like very, you know, and that sort of comes through in her sense of being concerned about her reputation. And also I think it comes through in her sense of superiority that she has over her sister, right? That her sister is the one who keeps falling apart and can't keep it together, and, you know, is ridiculous with all of her affairs. And Judith is like, you know, one of her ways of coping is, thank God I'm not her, you know, like, and then now we see her, whatever before Peter happened, whatever one of the ways she was coping with wherever she was there with her changing identity was trying to find, like, looking for a new job, right? So she was obviously experiencing some sort of shift in identity, and she was looking for ways to help her work with that. So one section of the coping asks about what religious or spiritual traditions do they use to cope with stress. And I don't think we see a lot of this with Judith, like, surprisingly, right? She's Daniel's wife, but we don't really actually get a sense until this last episode of where she fits in, you know, what's her faith story. We don't see that until the end. until this last episode. But what we see there is that she asks questions, right? Like or that even though it didn't seem so on the outside through all of the beginning episodes, by the time we get to this last one, when she's in crisis, we can see that she has deep spiritual questions, which just sort of like burst out of her. And so I think from that sense, we see that she's working on it all the while, but it just hadn't been apparent to us. And I think Bertram did a really great job of counseling her and helping her change the way that she understood God. Clearly she had formulated this sense of a God that needed to be satisfied through suffering. And I think she was suddenly realizing, suddenly feeling fearful, because if it could happen again, it means that kind of God is insatiable. And that's terrifying. So thank goodness for Bertram to kind of reframe that and just be like, that's not what God's about. So and I think she ultimately knew that because she came around to it really quickly. So yeah. And finally, number 4, she doesn't seem to be a suicide risk. She has a really solid social network. And even though sometimes doesn't always reach out in ways as quickly as she should, I think she has people who would notice if she were heading in that direction. Mm-hmm. All right, so that's my assessment. That's really long. Sorry, guys.
That's all right. No, I don't know how else we do it. So, Adam, you want to talk about Lorraine a little?
Yeah. So, I in the reading from During, I saw she had made a chart, which I found that very helpful to frame it that way. I like charts. Putting it in rows and columns makes a lot of sense to me. So that's how I laid it out for Lorraine. Same questions as Shada was looking at, but laid out in a chart form helps me to see where we're going. So a good tool. But for Lorraine, the losses for her are obviously her health currently and her mobility. She's slowing down. She's aging. And so some of this is natural and some of it is not as natural. It's diabetes, right?
Right.
And there's no real dealing with that, except I thought she was going to hit Grace on the last episode, but didn't quite get to that. And she's
I imagine she might have spanked them when they were little. She seems like she might have.
It's possible.
She seems old school.
Yeah. And she's coping with that loss, I think in 2 ways. One, using marijuana when she can, which is, I think it's now legal medically in New York State, but probably was not at the time. But that, I would say that's probably a healthy way. She found something that alleviates her pain. But she's also dealing with it, in denial. That loss, she wants to push it away, and she's coping with it by working as hard as she can and not mentioning it. Grace, don't bring it up. This is not happening. And then when she has a conversation with her daughter, it's like, nope, that's enough. I'm done with this conversation. So she knows there's a problem, but she's not willing to she's not ready to take those steps yet, it seems like. Looking at other losses, the conversation with her daughter was the time when we really got to know Lorraine and her situation. And her daughter brought up the issue of servitude and slavery. And so we wonder how much she's given up freedom for the situation she's in, working for the Websters. And in that kind of sense, in that loss of freedom and of choice of work. She seems she kind of put that on herself, as she doesn't have a choice. In terms of experience of violence, she gets guilt, I think, from her daughter, right? She gets pushback from her daughter. That's not physical violence, but there's definitely some emotional tension, if not violence, there between her and her direct family member. Yeah, she's working. Can't read my own writing. She's working harder again with that, trying to pay off what I think she sees as a debt to the family, and that circles back around to another kind of loss or the situation she's in. We get hinted at that she came from a place of poverty, or at least a place where she needed this job. We're not clear on what that means, but it's whatever situation she was taken from and given this job, she feels a huge sense of an obligation to fulfill this debt and to work for this family for as long as she possibly can, even though her body is starting to fail her. But it's not an option for her at this time to stop working. I had another thought while I was talking. But in the other violence, I mean, the violence towards Jimmy's loss and the violence towards Peter hits her as a family member. She's not a family member, but she's close. You can see that with her relationship with Grace, especially. When in the previous episode, Grace, she said something like, you've cared for me for so long, I have an obligation now to care for you. I mean, that's a familial kind of thing. You see that the violence hits Lorraine as well when she's in church and dealing with the family, and she wants to be there and provide for the family, even though this is also a work, she's getting compensated for her care for the family. So those are the things I thought of. Was there anything else I missed about Lorraine?
No, I think you did a good job. I just feel like I need to circle back to Bertram for just a second or two to talk about the loss and the violence and coping, because that's in my second triangle sort of deal. Obviously, the wife and his loss of this relationship, and I thought it was really interesting with the flashbacks, how we saw their relationship, how it was, and now we knowing what it has become is. That was striking, and it was really interesting because of the going back and forth. And I wanted to go back to a relationship that Bertram had with Daniel. There was a certain amount of violence, maybe that's strong for it, but in the way that he treated Daniel in terms of expectations and all that sort of thing. So it had me set up to not like Bertram very much. And I think as I've explored his character, and particularly in this episode, when I see the way that he cares, not only for Judith, but he's caring for other members of the family. And if you watch he's kind of in the background doing all that sort of thing. And I have real sympathy for him in terms of thing. I've never had anybody be in that situation with Alzheimer's before, or dementia before, to that extent. But I can imagine what he's talking about, and I can imagine his relationship developing with the other bishop without any problem. I mean, I don't know that I merge into it necessarily, but I certainly don't pull away from it. It doesn't repulse me that he needs somebody in his life. And I don't know. His experience of God, I thought, was really interesting. And like you say, it comes out in that discussion with Judith. Isn't love what God wants? And so that sort of resonated with me. And in terms of systematic analysis or assessment, God, he's in the middle of, the Episcopal Church. You would think that would be a place of, that would hold people and it's a place of great privilege, like you said, but at the same time, its whole purpose is to transform people and gather them together, transform them, and send them out into the world. But you wonder how they're taking care of him. So,
yeah, you're really right. I really feel for Bertram in a lot of ways. That's the loss of his wife, right, is a slow, long, drawn out process. And my grandmother had Alzheimer's, and I witnessed what it did to my dad. More than me, I was never close with my grandmother on that side, but it's lonely and painful. So,
yeah. And it's so interesting to see that, right? Like, we do have great empathy for him starting this relationship with the other bishop, like, and he is reaching out for support, but it's like sideways through a back channel, right? Like, he's not officially talking to his kids about it. He's not reaching out for any caregiver counseling of any kind, but he reached out it in a less sanctioned manner, in a way that he has to keep secret, but he did it anyway, because you can't cope by yourself in a situation like that.
I like that you brought that up. People, it seems like we find ways, right? No matter what we're going through, we're going to find a way. And it's, for him, there's certainly a pride aspect for his position, and a shame that, I can't cope with the slow loss of my wife. I mean, he finds he copes the best he can. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of sells him short, this whole business about Peter and Daniel, to a certain extent, trying to protect him from Peter's being gay. I don't know. I don't get the idea. I mean, it probably would be not welcomed with open arms, and the whole business about him setting him up with the girl and all that kind of stuff, that's pretty typical. I don't know. I don't know. I think that I think maybe they should have just dealt with it earlier, and I don't think he was gonna have a stroke.
I think that was a season 2 cliffhanger if they didn't.
Yeah, there you go. Will the bishop have a stroke or not? I love it. Do we want to try this kind of role play thing, or do we want to kind of gloss over that and say that we sort of have an idea what's going on? I'm open to suggestion, because we have a couple of more sections to take a look at.
I'm just twiggling. I'm staring vaguely, but no, I'm actually looking at the PowerPoint trying to figure out.
Well, maybe I don't want to act as Lorraine. Certainly,
yeah,
I could, but do we want to, like, one of the other of us give sort of, after hearing kind of the problems, maybe give kind of a quick how you might approach them at first? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that'd be valuable.
Sure.
Like, we're at least meant to imagine ourselves, put ourselves imaginatively into that hospital situation. Like, I definitely admit to feeling like this was the most challenging part of being a chaplain and doing pastoral care for me, right? Is figuring out how to the point of contact, right? How to just start the contact. Because there's so many different situations, so many different ways it could go. And for Judith, at least, she seems like somebody who would try to make it seem like she was okay to a staff member, like, of the hospital, whether it was chaplain or not. Like, she would be like, she'd say she's fine, she's fine until she's not, and she falls apart. And then, right, she would probably end up relying, as she did, more on, her family members than a chaplain. So for me, it's really difficult to imagine how I would be able to be present for her in that situation. It seems like she was a little too distracted to, like, maybe just sit down and talk. and I don't like distracted, but like just like when you're in that highly stressed state, right? She seemed like not necessarily able to focus. So honestly, like if I had been a chaplain in that situation, I probably wouldn't have attempted to make a point of contact with her first. She didn't seem necessarily like the person who would be the most receptive.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw the family and knew them a little, right? She might not be, because she's surrounded by pastors. I mean, she's surrounded by priests. Like,
Right.
there's-
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I'm a PK, and my mom is often, surrounded by pastors, and it's sort of this like, oh, great. Well, I know what you're gonna do, and
Right. She
Exactly.
probably never wants to tell anyone anything because it'll end up in a sermon, right?
All right, there
Yeah,
you go.
well,
Great
that's it.
example.
But yeah, so like, how do you approach Judith without being like you? I think you'd have to either use humor, right? Not in the hospital room, obviously, but you'd have to find a way in that isn't, I don't know, that isn't typical.
Right.
You have to relate to her, I think, in a non. I don't know. I would try to open with her in an interesting way, or I would say, tell me the story. Just maybe she
Right.
does want another year. I don't know, but
Or
yeah,
maybe,
with the
or
fact
maybe
that
I
you're-
default to like just taking care of her physical needs for a little bit, right?
Mm,
Like,
yeah.
do you need water? Do you need a drink? Like, like, yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
And
Michael.
I was just going to pick up on what Adam said about being a preacher's kid and understanding that dynamic. You could certainly start in with something like, yeah, this must be kind of like rough for you in a situation or in a different way than it would be for somebody else, or something to empathize or to get that conversation started. I guess, I don't know. I have
Right.
no idea what I'm talking about. So.
Well, and as from the omnipotent narrator kind of place that we are, knowing everything about her history, but as a random chaplain in a hospital coming upon her, we would know nothing about the Jimmy loss, right?
Exactly.
Like, so yeah, like I'm trying to imagine.
I mean,
I
we
had-
walk
yeah.
in there thinking this is a good prognosis for this
Right.
patient. And why is the
exactly.
mother flipping out? Yeah. I'm with you.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I
Yeah.
have no idea.
And you know what? My mind just keeps going also to the sister, because like she's not in it very much, but she's in it enough where we're kind of giving clues that she was involved. And I often just kept thinking about the role of doctors, right? And that so often they have to close themselves down to be able to function in that space, and that that there were times that I wanted to offer pastoral care to the staff there, and they weren't able to accept it because that meant opening up a space that they couldn't be in. And so I just think about her and her having to play the dual roles. I mean, I think in our text says something about conflicting dual roles somewhere.
Yes, exactly.
Where she was a family
Yeah.
member and involved with his care. That must have been really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to jump off that, I don't want to get too far off topic, but I'm really glad that it wasn't Peter's funeral, because Daniel was preaching, and I was like,
Yeah,
How
right?
could you know that, right?
no
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not a good idea. I mean, I'm sure somebody could, but it's just not a good idea.
No.
So anyway,
I have a weird weekend story for you that may relate to how I would approach Bertram.
Mhm.
This fraught relationship that I have with my own bishop. I was at a diocese event Friday night into Saturday, and I asked her. I just, in my own kind of weird way to try to make conversation, I asked her how she was doing, and she started to tell me how she was doing, and she started to tell me about how many nights she was out and how, as she's feeling her way along, she's a baby bishop. She's only been a bishop for a little over a year, and about how many evenings. And I said, well, one of the things that they talk about at seminary is, and I went into the whole kind of self-care, and you got to take care of yourself, and you're not going to be any good for anybody else if you're going to, kill yourself. I just can't. I have to go to all these meetings, these night things. It's when the church gathers. I'm going, oh my God, here's a woman who's struggling, not struggling, but I mean, she's like establishing herself, and she's trying to do all the right things to kind of involve people in the diocese and make her presence known. And kind of, she has a 3-year plan of listening to people and going out and forming disciples. And, she's doing amazing stuff. But at the same time, there's this human being who really needs to be cared for. And so I just started the conversation in my own goofy way of saying, how you doing? And amazingly, it went someplace that I had no idea, that it was going to go to. So it was weird because I was also thinking of Bertram and having to talk about Bertram. And then my bishop does this to me, just kind of, it's weird how that worked. So that's my weird story about how I would approach him. I would probably go, hey, how you doing? One old white man to another old white man, right?
I think that's a good approach. Yeah. I mean, if I approached Lorraine and didn't know anything about her, I guess I would try the same way. Like, how are you? What's going on? Or, what can you tell me about this? I'm attracted to this storytelling kind of aspect of this narrative way of pastoral care, because and Kornfeld's kind of approach, which is that short term, let the person tell you what they need. So I guess I would try to practice that. Sounds like, Shada, you've had more experience than Michael or I, but
either of us for sure.
And I'm sure that can go well. And I'm sure that there are times where you say, tell me what's going on. And they say, no, thank you. I suppose is good enough. Right. But how do you get into a person like Lorraine? She would, I don't know, if you're approaching her in the hospital room, which I hadn't thought of it this way, but she might be someone, because she would probably be someone you could see as taking care of everyone else. So she might be a good person to talk to be able to tell the story that the family may not be able to tell. Maybe. So she might be someone to pull aside and say, can you tell me what you know, how I can help? Or sorry. Some of our readings said cautioned against that too soon, because that's my first instinct. But tell me what's going on, Yeah.
I think that's a pretty good instinct. Oftentimes, like, it's sort of there's two ways to look at that. Oftentimes someone who is not a primary relationship to the situation, but like slightly extended, they will either be forgotten about, or they may well be better able to connect because they're just not quite in the center of the storm. So I think those go with good instincts overall, for sure.
Sounds good. All right, we're going to declare that part done, I think, and go on to everybody's great relief. Huh? So the fourth section in the book of Daniel was, why does Jimmy have to die? And the talking between Daniel and Jesus. And then that weird thing with Jimmy asking Daniel, do you still love me? And he says, that's a stupid question. The whole where is God part in the sermon. Adele's visit when she comes into the hospital room and Judith and Daniel are on the bed kind of like half asleep, and they see that as, I don't know, was it the angel coming for Peter? I don't know. So that whole section, the question is, how's the family experiencing Jimmy versus Peter's crisis, and how are they different, and what complications does Jimmy's long and chronic sort of illness that ended as a terminal illness relate to the acute situation with Peter. So could we talk a little bit about that maybe?
Well, something that Shada was talking about made me think of this. Judith, we see her theology when she's talking with Bertram, right? So we've noticed from the first episode that she's coping by drinking alcohol and being a little cold, a little on edge. And the last question there says, how has Jimmy's death impacted the ways of coping that you've seen? And I know that the 5 stages of grief aren't always the best thing, but it seems like everyone has bargained with God, right? To some degree. Judith says that to Bertram. Well, isn't this enough? Like, okay, I've come to peace. He took one of my kids. This isn't, we can't do this again. And we made a deal, right? It's kind of the idea. And it seems like Daniel is doing the same kind of thing, only just with the pills, right? Well, I just need this just to keep me going. So they're all kind of, going to this place, grabbing onto something to get by. Grace in healthy and unhealthy ways with her art, but also dealing to get to her art. Everyone's finding a way to cope, to get through from the first episode. So if Peter is lost, all of that starts over, or is completely broken. All the covenants they think they've made, these unhealthy covenants, are broken again. And I mean, then you really do get to kind of, again, I don't know much about PTSD, but it seems like then you get to this point where trauma follows trauma follows trauma, and I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to see a way out of that.
So that's just my observation, I guess.
No, I think it's straight on.
Yeah.
I think the quality of the two situations are different in that they had time with Jimmy, and they had these protracted conversations with him, and they adventure with, like throwing darts down at the bar and all that kind of stuff, so that there was a total different quality to that than what's going on with Peter.
That's interesting too, because that's something I hadn't thought a lot about before the lecture. The difference between traumatic grief or sudden loss and anticipated loss. That's what Dr. Swain was talking about, and how different they can be. And clearly we have examples of both of those here. So yeah, I think you're right on with that. So that the coping that they, if you're following what I was saying, if we're coping from one which was anticipated, how are you going to cope with one that's not?
Right. Well, and even just on a really, really superficial level, right? I was just thinking how weird and strange it must be to have them be identical twins and then be in those situations. Like, if you want to talk about like subconscious PTSD triggers and flashbacks, right? Like seeing your identical other son in the hospital bed, right? Like, if that doesn't bring up stuff, that's just, so Daniel's waking up, like, don't take him, right? Like, obviously he's back in that space. He's been taken back, right? Simply not only because of like peripheral and marginal similarities to the situation, but like literally almost like the same person, So, I mean, like even just on that level, you imagine how traumatic that would be to almost literally relive it,
Yeah, they're in the same hospital. At one point I thought, is that the same room? And that would just be
right.
Too freaky.
Yeah. But I also thought, like, so that conversation that Jimmy said about, like, do you love me? Like, certainly he seemed to be a kid who was really perceptive. but I thought it was interesting, like when you're saying you have to love the whole of me, which it includes my leukemia and my death and all of that, which I thought was a really liberative theology. And I thought it was so interesting in how it also could be brought forward to Peter's situation as well, right? Like to have overtones for Judith especially, right? Like, can she love the whole of Peter as well, right? And loving the whole of Peter has connection to loving Jimmy because they're identical and they're twins. And right, like, so loving Peter in a way means loving the loss of Jimmy, which like seems like such, that just seems like you need a super high level of conscious integrative work to get to that place, right? To have progressed to that kind of awareness and theology that holds both of those experiences. Like, yeah, that seems.
And it goes with that statement of Jesus's right before that, when he says, you're asking the wrong question, not why should the kid die, but why did he live?
Yeah.
And that your job is to take this opportunity to see people differently and to ask why everybody that you encounter lives, why is the universe, what was the wording? I forget, calling them into participation or something.
Oh,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Wow. I mean, that you talk about highly integrative. I'm going, I don't know. I'm glad, Jesus probably passed his pastoral care class with flying colors, but holy moly, that's pretty high level and integrative, I think. So I don't know. How about if we just end up with the plan of care sort of thing? We're supposed to take a look at the very end. This is the section where Daniel talks in the pulpit about burdens that God doesn't give us a burden we can't bear, but in community and with all of these other people. He talks about, the circus of horrors that are out there, and the healing, the love that we end up comes from God. Don't forgive me, he says, I think, after he smacks the guy around that beat his son, when he grabs Jesus. That whole sort of mess there at the end, I think. And then the family dinner where Peter is restored to the table. What do you make of this plan of care for these people going forward, whether there are characters by themselves or whether they're the whole family?
So,
sorry, the clock will stop soon.
Okay, so what would your recommendations be regarding 1, attending to safety and building trust? So for Judith, it seems like at this point, well, her safety is not in question, but her dealing with the level to which she is disengaged from people, maybe, would be like that she and Peter need to rebuild some trust for sure. So I think that would need to be a focus for her plan of care going forward. Because
can you imagine I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, can you imagine her always wanting to know where Peter is and always kind of like doing the hovering thing as a result? Like, I'm never going to let him out of my sight again.
Right,
sort of
over-functioning, right?
Yeah.
Over-functioning instead of like taking it as an opportunity to go deeper into all of the things that she's been avoiding, maybe. Because I think her relationship to Peter is kind of a key to a lot of her stuff. And ultimately, I think building that relationship with him would help her grieve more in a different way for Jimmy as well. Number 2, well, mourning losses. Okay, so I sort of talked about that as well. That I feel like that. I mean, in a way, these recommendations are almost like they can never be separate, right? And then reconnecting with the ordinariness of life, like they're always all connected. In that, I think she has expectations of Grace that have to do with her fear of losing her to things beyond her control. When that manifests as caring about her reputation, as if I think when that is in place, then she can finally let go or something, right? Like if the veneer is fine, then things are fine, right? And that's the only way she knows how to feel okay. So it's sort of all the way she feels about having to be in control, I think does affect all of her relationships. So maybe exploring that aspect, and in particular with her relationship with Peter, I think would be part of her plan of care.
And
helping, and just also just like, and helping and encouraging her to reach out to the network of care that she does have, right? Because like this is assuming that she's agreed to, ongoing care with you or somebody. So, but yeah.
How would you talk to her about? I mean, maybe it's just part of the care, but it seems like her wanting to reconnect with politics and getting back to work is complicated. I mean, there's a thread there with Daniel's brother always having loved her, which I'm kind of glad we didn't have to play out that that story, but whichever way it would have went. But for her, I mean, clearly getting back to some, she was trying to seek some purpose after being a mother for all these years. I don't know. I think it's important that would be reconnecting with the ordinariness of life that she's already saying she wants to do. So think about that.
Well, and just helping her get clear about whether that for her is running away from her experience as a mother, like whether she carries any sense of failure and, and wanting to get back to something that she used to be competent at, or whether or not, like, so just figuring out whether or not that's life-giving or not, like really understanding and according to whatever decision she gets to on that,
It'd be really cool if it was some way to integrate her political thing with the mothering that she feels called to do. I mean, I'm not going to obviously suggest this to her, but if she had a younger candidate or somebody who was just beginning to explore politics, like
mentoring,
as opposed to Worth, who's problematic. His name is so I don't know. Let me do Bertram really quickly. In my mind, I think what we've got to do is be really honest and open with him. And I think we need to keep him involved in the family as much as possible. It was good to see him at the table at the end of that episode. We know going forward, he's going to need even more care than he has right now. So
right, and clearly Worth is luggage, right? Like Worth is, it's old Daniel.
Yeah, exactly. So loving and keeping honest and allowing him the space that if he wants to talk about the relationship with the other bishop, hey, that would be okay. I don't know. That would be a sign of kind of like the miracle that Kornfeld talks about if they could actually have that conversation. So.
For Lorraine, I think it's just finding a way to address her health issues, first of all, right? And to try to get her to see that if, as some of the characters told her, if she's not able to function, she's not going to be a help to anyone, and causing yourself more pain just because you feel this debt for others that's not what the family wants for her. So finding a way into that to build trust and to make her feel safe discussing all of that. clearly the family cares for her and wants her to be a part of the household. Maybe drawing more clearly the lines between employee and friend, or figuring out how those interact might be a way to help her moving forward.
And the issue of agency is so important there, I think. Is like, what does it look like for her to live in this family and to lose some of that agency, but still feel that she has a place and that she has a function? So I don't know.
Right on.
Again, clearly I have no idea what I'm doing,
No,
but I'm
I think that's
giving you my thought.
No, that's a great way to look at agency, right? Or how are you being of service? And if you're not, if you're just causing yourself pain, sure, I guess you're still baking extra cookies, but you're not really helping, right? You're not.
Right.
This isn't a holistic picture for you. So
right.
How do we get her to have a conversation with Daniel or Judith where they can talk and make a plan together eventually for her moving forward, and find ways to reconnect with her daughter, in honest and helpful ways.
It all sounds so easy, doesn't it? When we're talking about it. Anything else anybody wants to put on the video before we stop it for a few moments and talk about where we go from here? Hearing none?
Well, the final theological reflection around God not giving us what he thinks we can't handle. I've kind of always hated that phrase, but I kind of liked how it was framed, right? And how you explained it, Michael, right? This sense of like, that is true, assuming that the burden is shouldered by many, right? So that it doesn't become a function of God's expectation of us, one person, but rather an opportunity for community. And I'm like, yeah, I could get on board with it then.
Yeah, that's the only way I've heard that spun, where I'm like, okay, that's all
right.
Well, I really want to know the writers of this show, and I want them to write more episodes. I'm sorry that there's just one more left, because I think it's pretty interesting. I've become very fond of the characters.
Yeah, I don't want to keep us too long, but you brought up Daniel at the end saying, "Please don't forgive me," and that's really powerful, because I think that's why we all cope in unhealthy ways, right? Well, not everyone, but that's why many people cope in unhealthy ways, because if you're forgiven, then you say you're okay. We hold on to that, like, I'm not good enough idea. So I thought that was really powerful while he's clinging to Jesus physically, right? Yeah. Which normally I'm not really on board with talking to Jesus. It gets a little, I get it, but I'm always worried about where it's going, but that was a powerful moment.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really important question that you ask, like, why do you take Vicodin then if you're forgiven? Sort of, you lose that whole way of being if you're really forgiven. So that's maybe the transformation that we're called to go through.
Right.
So, all right, guys. I think we did good for an hour of conversation about 30 million questions. God love you. Dr. Swain, thank you. If you've listened this long, you're a better man than I am. So let me stop.